the warrant that exposed everything: Africa, Interpol, and the power of defiance. What if an arrest warrant could spark a political storm, not in Europe, but across Africa? When Interpol issued a red notice against Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the transitional leader of Burkina Faso, it wasn't just a legal move. It was a signal. A message that echoed far beyond the borders of West Africa. One that questioned who really holds power and who gets to define justice. For many in the global South, the warrant didn't represent the rule of law. It represented something else, the long shadow of empire redrawn in modern ink. This video is not a defense of any one man. It's a look at the global system that allowed this moment to happen. A system where legal instruments are sometimes used not for justice, but for control. So stay with us, not just to understand what happened, but to understand why it matters to Britain, to Africa, and to anyone who believes in a fairer world. Subscribe and take this journey with us. The warrant that sparked a movement. It started with a document, not a speech, not a protest, not a headline. A red notice, quietly issued by Interpol, calling for the arrest of Captain Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso's transitional leader. In Europe, it barely registered. Another political figure facing international scrutiny. Another legal notice in a world full of them. But in Africa, the reaction was anything but quiet. In cities like Bamako, Dakar, Ouagadougou, and beyond, the news ignited not fear, but fury. Not submission, but solidarity. Across social media, a phrase emerged again and again. We stand with Traoré. Why? Because to many Africans, this wasn't just a legal instrument. It was a symbol of a world order they believe was never designed to serve them. A system where courts sit in Europe, but judgments fall on Africa. Where laws are written in London, Brussels, and Washington, but enforced in the global South. To understand the reaction, we must understand the man at the center. Ibrahim Traoré is not a career politician. He's a military officer who seized power during a time of intense insecurity and frustration in Burkina Faso. His government has been criticized for its tactics, yes, but also praised by supporters for rejecting dependency, foreign influence, and the continued extraction of African resources by multinational firms. He speaks in a voice that resonates with a growing segment of Africa's youth, unfiltered, unapologetic, Pan-African. In his speech after the warrant was issued, he didn't deny the charges. He rejected the legitimacy of the system issuing them. Interpol may issue whatever warrant it wishes, he said. But the people of Africa do not bow to Interpol. Do not bow to France. Do not bow to the United States. Do not bow to the European Union. That message struck a nerve, and not just in Africa. Because it raised a difficult question, even here in the UK. Can we truly call global justice neutral when it is so often aligned with global power? Interpol presents itself as a politically neutral organization, and technically, it is. But Interpol does not issue warrants on its own. Red notices are requested by member states. And critics argue that those requests can be, and have been, used for political ends. There's precedent, from dissidents pursued across borders to opposition figures flagged by regimes seeking legitimacy. The question isn't whether law matters, it's whether the law is equally applied. In Traoré's case, supporters believe the red notice is not about crimes. It's about defiance, about a leader who has said no to foreign bases, no to unfair contracts, no to silence. And whether one agrees with his methods or not, the response from the public is telling. In the streets of Ouagadougou, the red notice became a protest symbol. Not feared, but worn. Painted on banners, printed on t-shirts, carried in marches that cried out, "This is not justice. This is control." And so a question emerges, not just for Africa, but for those of us watching from afar. When do legal tools stop protecting justice and start preserving power? This isn't about glorifying rebellion or excusing violence. It's about listening to a region that is no longer willing to whisper. A region asking hard questions about history, about equity, and about who decides what justice looks like. And maybe, just maybe, that conversation needs to happen in Britain too. Because if a single red notice can shake the foundations of trust in global justice, what happens when a generation decides to stop accepting the terms of the old world? The reaction, Nobody expected when the Interpol Red Notice went public. The expectation, at least in diplomatic circles, was silence. That Traoré would deny, downplay, or disappear. That his supporters might feel shame. That African governments would distance themselves to avoid confrontation with Europe or the United States. But that's not what happened. Instead, something broke, or perhaps something awakened. Within hours, solidarity messages flooded social media across Africa. Hashtags like Africa will not bow and We stand with Traoré trended not just in Burkina Faso, but in Senegal, Mali, Nigeria, Ghana. Rappers dropped freestyles. Academics published open letters. Protesters waved Pan-African flags in city centers. What the Red Notice achieved, ironically, was to elevate Ibrahim Traoré from a national leader to a continental symbol, not necessarily of perfection, but of pride, of refusal, of resistance. And in that symbolism, something deeper emerged. Because for many, this was not about one man. It was about a system, a global order perceived as unjust, where Western governments speak of democracy but support regimes that serve their interests, where justice is invoked but only selectively enforced, where Africa's resources continue to leave the continent but justice rarely enters. Back in the UK, few media outlets initially covered the warrant. And when they did, it was largely framed in legal terms. But slowly, some headlines began to shift. Burkina Faso leader defiant. Interpol warrant sparks Pan-African response. Still, the deeper questions remained underexplored. Why was this warrant issued now? Who requested it? And why did it resonate so strongly with millions? Traoré, in his viral speech, made it clear, "This is not about me. It is about every African who refuses to kneel before foreign capitals." And while some may dismiss that as rhetoric, the public response suggests otherwise. Take the words of Mariam, a 24-year-old university student in Dakar, interviewed by a local paper. They call him dangerous. But dangerous to whom? To the people? Or to the interests that keep us poor? Or Adama, a market vendor in Bamako? I don't follow politics. But when a man stands and says, Africa will keep its gold, I understand that. Even in the UK, among African diaspora communities, the reaction was vocal. Demonstrations were held in London and Birmingham. Petitions circulated calling for transparency in Interpol's decision-making. And in panel discussions, voices questioned whether institutions like Interpol have ever truly been neutral. Of course, not all responses were supportive. Some African leaders distanced themselves. Western diplomats expressed concern over Traoré's language, accusing him of inciting division. Editorials in European newspapers labeled him radical, unreliable, and a threat to international stability. But among the youth, particularly those who feel excluded by both globalization and local corruption, Traoré's words found fertile ground. Why? Because for decades, Africans have been told to play by the rules. But when the rules appear rigged, the reaction is not silence, it's skepticism. And eventually, it's resistance. The Red Notice became more than a legal tool. It became a mirror, reflecting a continent tired of double standards. And this is what the world didn't expect, that an attempt to isolate one man would unite millions. That a warrant designed to weaken would instead strengthen a broader movement. That a continent long silenced would not only speak, but roar. The Interpol Red Notice did not land on a passive Africa. It landed on an Africa that is watching, learning, and no longer willing to accept the terms of the old world. And now the question is, if this was the reaction to one warrant, what happens when the next leader speaks up? The political cost of speaking up defiance feels powerful. But what happens the morning after? In Burkina Faso, the emotional high of rejecting the Interpol warrant came with real, tangible risks. The international community may speak of dialogue and cooperation, but when a government steps outside the accepted lines, consequences often follow. Foreign aid discussions were paused. EU development projects were suddenly under review. Diplomatic delegations grew quieter. And investment risk assessments, the quiet killers of emerging economies, began flashing red. Burkina Faso's economy, already fragile due to conflict and instability, now faced a new pressure, the cost of political independence. Roughly 40% of its national budget depends on international donors, many of them Western. That leverage, while rarely discussed openly, is a form of soft power, not a sanction but a signal, and it works. Except this time the signal didn't lead to submission. It led to escalation. Traoré's government didn't back down. Instead, it doubled down. Contracts with several foreign mining companies were suspended for review. Officials announced a sweeping audit of resource deals signed over the past 2 decades. And more radically, Parliament began debating a proposal to nationalize gold and uranium sectors, 2 of Burkina Faso's most valuable assets. To some in the UK, this may sound extreme, but within Burkina Faso and across parts of Africa, it was hailed as long overdue. For decades, African nations have produced the raw materials that fuel the global economy, but seen little of the profit. Traoré framed it in blunt terms. If our land gives gold, our children should not starve. Of course, critics argue this path is reckless, that scaring off foreign investors will do more harm than good. That confrontation invites isolation, and they may have a point. But it also raises a deeper question. What is the true cost of sovereignty in a globalized world? In the UK, we often speak about national interest, about trade deals that benefit Britain, about energy security. But what does it mean when another nation, especially one still recovering from the scars of colonialism, makes similar demands? Is it respected or punished? Traoré's supporters say this is the double standard, that when African leaders speak of ownership, they're labeled radical. When they demand a fair share, they're treated as threats. And when they reject foreign influence, legal tools, like the Interpol notice, are suddenly deployed. And here's where the conversation turns uncomfortable. Because whether one agrees with Traoré or not, the broader issue remains. Many African countries are expected to remain suppliers, not competitors. To export minerals but not manufacture. To accept loans but not write their own rules. The political cost of speaking up, then, is not just diplomatic, it's systemic. And yet for many young Africans, that cost is worth paying. Because silence, they say, has cost even more. Still, the path forward is risky. Burkina Faso is surrounded by complex geopolitics, facing both internal insurgencies and external economic pressure. Traoré may be popular now, but popularity is not policy. And fiery speeches do not always feed hungry children. Which brings us to a critical point for outside observers, especially here in Britain. If the UK, the EU, and international institutions want to support peace and development in Africa, they must be willing to listen, not just to presidents, but to populations. To young people who no longer trust systems they see as biased. To governments trying to rewrite unequal deals. That doesn't mean abandoning standards, but it does mean applying them consistently. Because in a world where speaking up comes at a price, the silence of powerful nations speaks volumes. And if sovereignty is truly universal, then why are only some nations punished for claiming it? Interpol, empire, and the question of neutrality. For most people in the UK, Interpol evokes images of fugitives, cross-border cooperation, and international law enforcement. It's viewed as impartial, a kind of global referee in a world of crime and chaos. But for many in Africa, especially in the wake of Traoré's Red Notice, Interpol looks different. The organization doesn't issue warrants on its own. Member states submit requests, and while Interpol insists it does not act politically, critics argue that in practice, it can't always separate law from power. Over the years, human rights groups have documented cases where authoritarian regimes used red notices to pursue dissidents abroad, where activists, whistleblowers, or political opponents were flagged under the guise of criminal charges. In each case, the line between justice and persecution blurred. So when the red notice for Ibrahim Traoré appeared, requested under unclear circumstances, it was not viewed in isolation. It was seen as part of a larger pattern, a pattern where global legal tools, designed to protect order, are sometimes repurposed to defend interests, where leaders who challenge the status quo, especially in Africa, find themselves under international scrutiny, while those who comply enjoy silence. And here lies the contradiction. If Interpol is truly neutral, why are its most controversial actions so often aligned with geopolitical interests? In Traoré's case, no court hearing preceded the red notice. No public trial, no clear explanation, just a declaration and a firestorm. The African Union remained mostly silent. ECHO was. once quick to condemn undemocratic power grabs, said little. The European Union defended Interpol's legitimacy but offered no transparency. The United States issued vague statements about upholding norms. Meanwhile, Interpol itself maintained its standard response. We do not comment on individual notices. But to millions, that silence spoke louder than any statement. It suggested that neutrality, as defined by institutions built in the West, may not feel neutral to those governed from the outside. That what some see as law, others see as legacy, the legacy of empire, updated in bureaucratic form. This doesn't mean rejecting global justice. It means asking who defines it, who controls it, and who it truly serves. And if Interpol wants to protect its credibility, it must reckon with a difficult truth. Neutrality is not how you define yourself. It's how the world experiences your actions. A red notice, a global reckoning, an arrest warrant, a speech, a continent stirred. What began as a bureaucratic move by Interpol has exposed something far greater, a global conversation about justice, power, and who gets to decide the rules. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's words may have been fiery, even provocative, but the reaction they sparked cannot be ignored, because behind the slogans and defiance lies a deeper truth. For millions of Africans, international institutions no longer feel like guardians. They feel like gatekeepers. And that should matter, not just in Ouagadougou or Bamako, but in London, Manchester, Birmingham. Because the UK prides itself on fairness, rule of law, and democratic values, yet we live in a world where those principles are not felt equally, where leaders who challenge economic dominance are branded dangerous, where legal tools may reflect old hierarchies more than modern justice. This isn't about taking sides. It's about asking questions. What role should Britain play in a post-colonial world? Can we support global accountability without reinforcing global inequality? Are we willing to hear uncomfortable truths, not to agree but to understand? The red notice for Traoré will eventually fade from the headlines, but the questions it raised will not. They echo in classrooms, in courtrooms, in conversations across continents. And maybe that's the point, because justice cannot be global if trust is not. And trust begins not with silence, but with listening. So to you, the viewer, what does neutrality mean in a world shaped by empire? And when the rules feel rigged, what does it truly mean to speak up?